Blades, without making any noise, seemed to him like those terrible phantoms of whom he had heard the charcoal burners speaking, the Comprachos, who hunt only at night, and if they meet a man turn him into a hind and chase him. But he thought of the pretty Infanta and took courage. He wanted to find her alone and tell her that he too loved her. Perhaps she was in the room beyond. He ran across the soft Moorish carpets and opened the door. No, she was not here either. The room was quite empty. It was a throne room, used for the reception of foreign ambassadors, when the king, which of late had not been often, consented to give them a personal audience. The same room in which many years before envoys had appeared from England to make arrangements for the marriage of their queen, then one of the Catholic sovereigns of Europe, with the emperor's eldest son. The hangings were of gilt Cordovan leather, and a heavy gilt chandelier with branches for 300 wax lights hung down from the black and white ceiling. Underneath a great canopy of gold cloth, on which the lions and towers of Castile were broidered in seed pearls, stood the throne itself, covered with a rich pall of black velvet studded with silver tulips and elaborately fringed with silver and pearls. On the second step of the throne was placed the kneeling stool of the Infanta, with its cushion of cloth of silver tissue, and below that again, and beyond the limit of the canopy, stood the chair of the papal nuncio, who alone had the right to be seated in the king's presence on the occasion of any public ceremonial, and whose cardinal's hat, with its tangled scarlet tassels, lay on a purple tabouret in front. On the wall facing the throne hung a life-sized portrait of Charles V. in hunting dress, with a great mastiff by his side, and a picture of Philip II receiving the homage of the Netherlands occupied the center of the other wall. Between the windows stood a black ebony cabinet, inlaid with plates of ivory, on which the figures from Holbein's Dance of Death had been graved, by the hand, some said, of that famous master himself. But the little dwarf cared nothing for all this magnificence. He would not have given his rose for all the pearls on the canopy, nor one white petal of his rose for the throne itself. What he wanted was to see the Infanta before she went down to the pavilion, and to ask her to come away with him when he had finished his dance. Here in the palace the air was close and heavy, but in the forest the wind blew free, and the sunlight with wandering hands of gold moved the tremulous leaves aside. There were flowers, too, in the forest, not so splendid, perhaps, as the flowers in the garden, but more sweetly scented for all that. Hyacinths in early spring that flooded with waving purple the cool glens and grassy knolls. Yellow primroses that nestled in little clumps round the gnarled roots of the oak trees. Bright celandine and blue speedwell and irises, lilac and gold. There were gray catkins on the hazels, and the foxgloves drooped with the weight of their dappled, bee-haunted cells. The chestnut had its spires of white stars, and the hawthorn its pallid moons of beauty. Yes, surely she would come if he could only find her. She would come with him to the fair forest, and all day long he would dance for her delight. A smile lit up his eyes at the thought, and he passed into the next room. Of all the rooms this was the brightest and the most beautiful. The walls were covered with a pink-flowered Lucca damask, patterned with birds and dotted with dainty blossoms of silver. The furniture was of massive silver, festooned with florid wreaths and swinging cupids. In front of the two large fireplaces stood great screens, broidered with parrots and peacocks, and the floor, which was of sea-green onyx, seemed to stretch far away into the distance. Nor was he alone. Standing under the shadow of the doorway at the extreme end of the room, he saw a little figure watching him. His heart trembled. A cry of joy broke from his lips, and he moved out into the sunlight. As he did so, the figure moved out also, and he saw it plainly. The Infanta! It was a monster, the most grotesque monster he had ever beheld. Not properly shaped, as all other people were, but hunchbacked and crook-limbed, with huge lolling head and mane of black hair. The little dwarf frowned, and the monster frowned also. He laughed, and it laughed with him, and held its hands to its sides, just as he himself was doing. He made it a mocking bow, and it returned him a low reverence. He went towards it, and it came to meet him, copying each step that he made, and stopping when he stopped himself. He shouted with amusement, and ran forward, and reached out his hand, and the hand of the monster touched his, and it was cold as ice. He grew afraid, and moved his hand across, and the monster's hand followed it quickly. He tried to press on, but something smooth and hard stopped him. The face of the monster was now close to his own, and seemed full of terror. He brushed his hair off his eyes. It imitated him. He struck at it, and it returned blow for blow. He loathed it, and it made hideous faces at him. He drew back, and it retreated. What is it? He thought for a moment, and looked round at the rest of the room. It was strange, but everything seemed to have its double in this invisible wall of clear water. Yes, picture for picture was repeated, and couch for couch. The sleeping faun that lay in the alcove by the doorway had its twin brother that slumbered, and the silver Venus that stood in the sunlight held out her arms to a Venus as lovely as herself. Was it Echo? He had called to her once in the valley, and she had answered him word for word. Could she mock the eye as she mocked the voice? Could she make a mimic world just like the real world? Could the shadows of things have color and life and movement? Could it be that— He started, and taking from his breast the beautiful white rose, he turned round and kissed it. The monster had a rose of its own, petal for petal the same. It kissed it with like kisses, and pressed it to its heart with horrible gestures. When the truth dawned upon him, he gave a wild cry of despair, and fell sobbing to the ground. So it was he who was misshapen and hunchback, foul to look at and grotesque. He himself was the monster, and it was at him that all the children had been laughing. And the little princess, who he had thought loved him, she too had been merely mocking at his ugliness, and making merry over his twisted limbs. Why had they not left him in the forest, where there was no mirror to tell him how loathsome he was? Why had his father not killed him rather than sell him to his shame? The hot tears poured down his cheeks, and he tore the white rose to pieces. The sprawling monster did the same, and scattered the faint petals in the air. It grovelled on the ground, and when he looked at it, it watched him with a face drawn with pain. He crept away lest he should see it, and covered his eyes with his hands. He crawled like some wounded thing into the shadow, and lay there moaning. And at that moment the Infanta herself came in with her companions through the open window, and when they saw the ugly little dwarf lying on the ground and beating the floor with his clenched hands in the most fantastic and exaggerated manner, they went off into shouts of happy laughter, and stood all around him and watched him. "His dancing was funny," said the Infanta, "but his acting is funnier still. Indeed, he is almost as good as the puppets, only of course not quite so natural." And she fluttered her big fan and applauded. But the little dwarf never looked up, and his sobs grew fainter and fainter, and suddenly he gave a curious gasp and clutched his side, and then he fell back again and lay quite still. "That is capital," said the Infanta after a pause, "but now you must dance for me." "Yes," cried all the children, "you must get up and dance, for you are as clever as the Barbary apes, and much more ridiculous." But the little dwarf made no answer. And the Infanta stamped her foot, and called out to her uncle, who was walking on the terrace with the chamberlain, reading some dispatches that had just arrived from Mexico, where the Holy Office had recently been established. "My funny little dwarf is sulking," she cried. "You must wake him up, and tell him to dance with me." They smiled at each other and sauntered in, and Don Pedro stooped down and slapped the dwarf on the cheek with his embroidered glove. "You must dance," he said, "Petit Monsire, you must dance. The Infanta of Spain and the Indies wishes to be amused." But the little dwarf never moved. "A whipping master should be sent for," said Don Pedro wearily, and he went back to the terrace. But the chamberlain looked grave, and he knelt beside the little dwarf and put his hand upon his heart, and after a few moments he shrugged his shoulders and rose up, and having made a low bow to the Infanta, he said, "Mi bella princesa, your funny little dwarf will never dance again. It is a pity, for he is so ugly that he might have made the king smile." "But why will he not dance again?" asked the Infanta, laughing. "Because his heart is broken," answered the chamberlain. And the Infanta frowned, and her dainty rose-leaf lips curled in pretty disdain. "For the future, let those who come to play with me have no hearts," she cried, and she ran out into the garden. End of The Birthday of the Infanta, by Oscar Wilde.